Hey guys, welcome back to the Den. So this week on the Den, in honor of the top 5 audition videos, we decided that we would base this week's topics on their suggestions. So Bryce sent in the suggestion for the top 5 albums that most influenced your life. So this was a really easy list for me, or at least it was at first, and then the list got bigger than 5, around 10, 15, 20, 25, and then I just had to stop, cut back, edit to the most influential. So these are my absolute top 5 most influential albums that completely changed my life. So for number 5 is the Cranberries, and that's Bury the Hatchet. Now this album, I think in total I've bought 4, maybe 5 times in total. Every time I lost it, I panicked and I went out and I bought a new copy. So I think I still have 3 or 4 copies of it. Now I had been an absolute fan of the Cranberries before this. This album came out when I was in grade 10, I believe. And I remember the build up to it. I was incredibly excited. The video premiered for Promises, where there was like a witch in an old western town. I remember waking up early and skipping school just to go downtown and buy the album. And my little CD Walkman, listened to it the entire way. I absolutely love that album. My favorite track off that album would be Animal Instincts. And for anybody who's seen the video, it is absolutely heart-wrenching, but it is so important and such a good message. So, now number 4 is actually an Aboriginal artist that not a lot of people in our era or generation or younger would know. Maybe people who grew up in the 60s would know. So that's Buffy St Marie and her album Coincidence and Likely Stories. Now Buffy St Marie was really big in the folk era back in the 60s, and she wrote songs for Joni Mitchell. She was absolutely one of the most influential Aboriginal women as far as folk music in the 60s and going forward. So I had the fortunate opportunity of going to see her in concert. I think I was around 8 or 9 years old, and it was by far one of the best concerts. I've been to several, and still to this day, just the energy specifically was just something I've never experienced before. And it actually really opened my eyes to Aboriginal and Anishinaabe music, as well as folk music in general. So this album, for anybody who hasn't heard it, it's a lot more political than her, well, I guess she's always really been political growing up in the 60s, but it was more like modern political, so it was something more that I could relate to. And to this day, I still listen to this album. So the best songs on the album, Star Walker, was my absolute favorite as a kid. But the absolute best song on the album that you need to hear is The Big Ones Get Away. And it was actually covered a few years ago by a folk singer in Sweden or Norway, I believe. So this is such an absolute relevant song for everything that's going on right now. So I'm going to provide a link for that in the description below, so that way you guys can check it out. Now number 3 is Post by Bjork. Now that album, I remember grade 8, grade 7, something like that. I was watching, I believe it was the European Music Awards, and it was the first time I had ever heard of Bjork. And she was performing I Miss You live, and I remember seeing the video thinking, what the hell is what is this? I need more of this in my life. And it's been an absolute love affair. I love everything that Bjork has done. I tend to lean a little bit more towards her early era, just because that's more what I relate to. In my opinion, Vespertine was one of the greatest albums that she's ever put out. But for this, I would have to say that Post is the album that was most influential, because it was my introduction to Bjork. Plus it has my absolute favorite of all time Bjork song, Hyper Ballad. So number 2 is actually a really old, not old, oh god, I feel old now. So number 2 was an album that I first heard when I was around 7 or 8 years old, and it was my first introduction to prog rock. That is Siamese Dream by the Smashing Pumpkins. This album, it introduced me to rock. It introduced me to progressive rock. It was my first real influence into real poetry and music, because honestly before that it was a lot of Raffi and Sharon Lois and Bram, for any Canadians out there. So while Siamese Dream wasn't their best album to date, to me it deserves the number 2 spot, simply because it was my introduction to progressive rock, to real poetry, like Billy Corgan style. It was my real influence to rock. So Siamese Dream definitely deserves the number 2 place on my list. So that brings us to number 1 and the most influential album that was in my life, and that is the Untitled album by Sigur Rós. If I'm pronouncing that right, Sigur Rós. I always feel like I'm butchering that, definitely, without a doubt, the most important album in my life. I have the cover, the open and closing brackets, I have that tattooed on the back of my leg. When I was around 18 or 19, I went through a lot of really dark times, a lot of issues with my father, a lot of issues with coming out, becoming an adult, leaving adolescence. It was just incredibly difficult, and I, for the life of me, could not find an outlet or something that really spoke to me, that something that I really related to. And so I remember hearing of the album through a friend. They told me if I like Lamb, which absolute huge fan, trip hop, shoegaze, rock, that sort of thing, then definitely I need to check this out, that it's a really important album. And it honestly is, in my opinion, the thing that got me out of my depression. I've always been a firm believer that when you're going through stuff, you have to embrace it, because if you just bury it, you're never gonna get over it. It's just gonna keep resurfacing. So when you're sad, cry. That sort of deal. So for me, I put that album on repeat, and it just spoke to me. Now, the thing that is most important to me about that album is it's not in English, it's not in Icelandic, it's not in any language. In fact, it's in a made-up language called Hopelandic, which Jonesy, the lead singer, created. And the basic reason for that is they had played these songs live for roughly 2 years. They were pretty much completed songs, and they didn't feel that it fit to add lyrics to completed songs. So what they did essentially is just left them all as untitled tracks and created his own structured language that was more like using his vocal cords as melodies instead of actual lyrics. So because it's written in Hopelandic and it's in its own language, it's really up to the listener to interpret the meaning and the intention behind the lyrics. So for me, it was a lot of hope, and a lot of the album gets dark at points, so there's a lot of despair and a lot of melancholy, but it definitely deserves a place at number 1 on my list. The problem with it, however, is because I have such a dark attachment to it, and because it got me through such a dark place in my life, it's really hard for me to listen to that album to this day. Every time I listen to it, it's very melancholy, and it, to a point, brings me back to that place if I listen to it too much. So it's kind of ironic and funny that my absolute most influential album of all time is one that I rarely listen to. But like I said, it definitely deserves that number 1 spot on the list. So I actually had a lot more to this list. Fear of Force by Lamb was definitely way up there. Insurgents by Steven Wilson, another one that was way up there. So there's a lot of really important music albums. The soundtrack to Purple Rain, Prince. So there's definitely a lot of very influential music that has influenced my life. So I don't know if any of you have heard of any of this music. If you do, if you like it, if you don't. So let me know what you guys think. Is there any music that has really helped you to get through your really dark and despairing times? And is there something that you could recommend to somebody else that might help them through those situations? So that's it for this week, guys. Well, thanks again for watching, guys. Remember to like, share, and subscribe. Have a great day, and take care.